I remember the day Nico walked into Marco's house. He walked carefully, his shoes tapping lightly on the polished wooden floor. Everything was strangely quiet. There was none of the usual noisy atmosphere, music and laughter coming from somewhere. The silence was unsettling, not peaceful, but hinting at something else, mysterious. Nico expected to see the usual chaos Marco was used to, but instead there was silence. Nico kept walking inside until he heard something, a strange rhythmic sound, like someone taking a deep, controlled breath. That led him to the solarium, and when he saw her, he just stopped. It was Marco's mom, Isabella, in the middle of a yoga pose. Her body was moving so gracefully from one pose to the next, her eyes closed, her face completely serene. Her movements were so fluid, almost hypnotic, and it was impossible not to notice how trim she was, how easy it all came to her. Nico seemed to swallow hard at that moment, caught up in curiosity, admiration, and something else he probably couldn't even name. Suddenly, Isabella opened her eyes and saw him, shrieking fearfully. "Nico, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, one leg still raised behind her back. Her cheeks turned pink, and she hurriedly pulled herself together, placing her hands on her hips. Nico looked away, clearly embarrassed, his face flushed. "Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sneak up on you," he stammered in an awkward voice. Isabella let out a nervous chuckle and stood firmly on both feet. "It's all right. I just wasn't expecting anyone," she said, adjusting her shirt and avoiding his gaze. In that moment, it seemed to Nico that something about her had changed. She wasn't the perfectly groomed Isabella he'd always known. She seemed real, vulnerable, as if he was seeing the real her for the first time. After a few seconds, Isabella gestured toward the kitchen, trying to ease the tension. "How about some tea, Nico? It'll give me a chance to catch my breath." He nodded and followed her, watching her move, still as gracefully as if carrying the calm of a yogi. But something had changed. Everything about her caught his attention, even the smallest of movements, and he felt guilty for noticing it, as if he'd crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed. In the kitchen, she set down 2 mugs, then held out her hand to him, and for a moment it was as if time had slowed down. They looked at each other, and there was something in her eyes, as if she were searching his face for the answer to a question she couldn't ask. Before either of them could think, they had closed the space between them. Their lips met, soft at first, then more urgent, as if they were trying to stifle the feelings that engulfed them. Nico was overwhelmed by her scent, the taste of her lips, the warmth of her hand on his neck. Nico barely had time to set the mug aside before his hands found her waist and pulled her to him. Isabella clutched at his shirt, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. All boundaries, all morals were gone. There were only them, lost in this raw, uncontrollable need. The kitchen, once so ordinary, was now a bubble, a place that held only them and emotions they couldn't fight. Suddenly, Isabella flinched and pulled away, stepping back, her breathing becoming ragged. "Nico, her voice broke, a barely audible whisper, and her eyes filled with more than desire. There was fear in them as well. I know, Nico replied, running his hands through his hair. His heart was pounding in his chest. What had they done? He could already imagine the consequences. Marco would never forgive them. He would lose his best friend, and Isabella would lose everything, her family, her place. And yet, even knowing all that, he couldn't regret it. Their eyes met again, and they silently understood each other. They knew the path they had chosen, and they knew the price they were willing to pay, even if it scared them. Now the space between them was filled with all the things they couldn't say out loud. The room held their guilt, their fear, and the longing that still burned brightly despite everything. "Nico, we can't let this happen again," Isabella said, her voice almost breaking. It was both a plea and an order, but neither of them moved. They both knew that something fundamental had happened between them. The line hadn't just been crossed, it had been erased. and even though they knew it was for the best, neither of them could deny the bond that had formed. They had no idea what would happen next, how they would manage to keep it a secret, or what it would mean for their future. But for now, they knew they were connected, entangled in a moment that began with a yoga pose and ended with an intense kiss and the whirlwind of emotions that followed. Nico could still feel the warmth of her touch on his skin as they stood, and the heavy and meaningful silence between them. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something that mirrored his feelings. A longing that had awakened and now did not want to be silenced. It frightened him, and yet he was drawn to her. Isabella turned away, her fingers touching the edge of the counter, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were trying to regain control of the situation. Nico watched her, his thoughts racing. He wanted to say something, anything that might clarify what had just happened, but the words wouldn't come. He knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't change the reality of their situation. The tension in the room was palpable, an invisible thread still binding them despite the distance it created. "I have to go," Nico finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed heavy, as if they contradicted everything he wanted. He took a step back, keeping his eyes on her. Isabella's shoulders tensed, and for a moment he thought she might turn around, that she might ask him to stay. But she didn't. She stood facing him, bowing her head slightly and resting her hands on the counter. "Yeah, that's probably best," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, giving away the emotion she was trying so hard to hide. She took a deep breath, and Nico saw her shoulders rise and fall as if she was trying to calm down. Nico turned and walked towards the door. Each step felt like a struggle with everything that was screaming at him to stay. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back at her one last time. She was still standing there, her back to him, her body tense. He wanted to remember her like this, vulnerable, real, and as conflicted as he was. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, anything to ease this moment, but nothing came out. "Take care of yourself, Isabella," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded but didn't turn around. Her silence spoke volumes. With those words, Nico walked out of the kitchen and left Marco's house with a heavy heart and confused thoughts. As Nico left, the cool air hit him and he took a deep breath, trying to clear his head. He knew this wasn't the end, not for him, not for her. The bond between them was too strong, too undeniable. He could still feel her, like an electric current running through his veins. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: everything had changed, and there would be no going back to the way things were. Isabella, meanwhile, stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter, her knuckles white. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She realized that Nico was right. He had to leave. They had to distance themselves from each other, if only for a while. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, she couldn't ignore the longing that still pulsed through her, the desire that had awakened and now refused to be buried. Letting out a shuddering sigh, she opened her eyes and stared at the empty kitchen. The room seemed different now, as if it held memories of what had just happened, the intensity of their kiss, the emotions that surfaced. She knew they couldn't let it happen again, but deep down she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. The line had been erased, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pretend otherwise. Isabella pushed herself away from the counter, her body feeling heavy and her heart feeling conflicted. She knew she had to come to terms with reality, had to figure out how to move on, but right now she needed to catch her breath and process everything that had happened. She made her way to the sunroom, the place where it had all started, and sat on the yoga mat, closing her eyes, trying to regain a sense of calm. But the calm didn't come, not now, not after everything that had changed. And as she walked away from Marco's house, Nico realized that he wouldn't be able to avoid Isabella forever. Eventually they would have to face each other again. They would have to find a way to deal with what had happened between them. But right now, he just needed to clear his head, sort out his feelings and desires. The future was uncertain, and their actions were a heavy burden, but one thing was certain: they weren't just Nico and Isabella anymore. They were something more, something complicated, something neither of them could ignore. As Nico walked to his car, the sun was already beginning to set, and the sky was tinted orange and pink. He stopped for a moment, looking back at Marco's house, its silhouette dark against the multicolored sky. He knew this was not the end, not at all. It was only the beginning of something that frightened him as much as it excited him. He took a deep breath, opened the car door and got in, mentally going over every moment, every touch, every look in his mind. And as he drove, Nico couldn't help but think about what would happen next, how they would meet Marco, how they would meet themselves. But despite the fear, despite the guilt, he couldn't deny one thing: he wanted to see her again. He wanted to feel that connection again, no matter what it cost him.